Britain's COP26, Alok Sharma hopes that nations at the United Nations Climate Summit would adopt texts later on Friday evening. With the summit scheduled to end today, negotiators have been working around the clock to try and clinch a deal that almost 200 countries can agree to, although many delegates expect that the conference to spill over to the weekend.
Friends, we've now had 38 parties who have been able to participate in this plenary, and I thank all of you for your interventions. My team and I have taken careful note of the comments and the proposals, and of course we will continue to engage extensively with you over the course of today. And I encourage you to also reach out to one another to try and build consensus. It is, of course, my hope that we will be able to find textual solutions for our outstanding issues quickly, and my intention is to publish clean versions of relevant text later today for parties' careful consideration and ultimately, I hope, adoption tonight.
Protesters and rights groups have been calling on negotiations to make the most of the final hours today.
It's here a call to really use the last hours of the negotiation of this agreement to have concrete actions on financing, for mitigation, so that we don't have the worst effects of climate change, for adaptation for those communities that are so affected, but to really focus on that 1.5 degree that allows us all to have hope for the future. So we need reductions of emissions. At the moment, we're going up in emissions. We need to reduce by 45% in the next 9 years. And we need countries to come back next year with serious pledges to make sure that we have a viable world. And do we want leaders who want to be remembered as the ones who really put out this fire and made a world that is safer and where we can all thrive?
Well, to get an update on where COP26 is heading, we're now joined by Anya Knechtel, who's Oxfam Policies Specialist on Climate and Natural Resources. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the programme.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. I mean, the COPs always have protesters, but it does seem that the protests that we've seen this week and today really are pointing to some disappointment at perhaps not as much being accomplished as could have been and was hoped. What's your take on COP26? It was supposed to be about strengthening agreements like what happened in Paris 2015.
Yes, absolutely. And I think what we've seen on the streets in terms of the protests is really a recognition of the urgency that is surrounding this particular COP. Right now, we're in the final hours, or what hopefully is the final hours of negotiations. And yet we still haven't seen countries take sufficient actions to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees or to support the most vulnerable populations to deal with the ongoing impacts of the climate crisis. As your previous audio there suggested, we're seeing a situation that scientists are saying that we need to cut global emissions by 45% in the next 9 years. And yet countries are still offering inadequate pledges to reduce emissions that are at this stage still setting us on a course for increasingly severe humanitarian and ecological disasters.
Now, if they know this and they've got clever scientists in these very developed countries, why is there a lethargy then in getting over the line?
This is a really troubling question, and I obviously don't know what goes on behind those negotiations, but what we are seeing is that in the most recent drafts of the text, we're still seeing language such as urging countries to table new emission reduction targets, or recognizing that there is a request that they take their target to a higher level. And at this stage, we really need strong commitments, not gentle encouragement. And, you know, some of the draft text is still missing some very vital elements. And probably the most glaring of those is any mention of a financial plan for loss and damages, such as the one that was proposed by the group of G77 nations. just last night. And so while we see promises of technical support, we're still not seeing the financial commitments that are required to help countries address the impacts that climate change is having.
Has anything been concluded and decided at COP26 other than the language that you're describing now, as in urging and encouraging, etc., etc.? Has anything actually been signed off that we can look at and say this was an achievement?
Well, COP is a good forum for pushing forward collective action. And so there have been a number of different initiatives. There's been an initiative to cut international financing to fossil fuel developments, which is a positive step. But we've also seen a push to end the use of coal-fired power more quickly around the globe. Obviously, that would have relevance for South Africa in terms of looking at how we can transition more quickly to renewable energy systems. So there have been some positive activities, but again, we're not seeing it on the scale or the tangible commitments that are going to keep us on track for a 1.5 degree world. And that's really what this comes down to. We're still seeing commitments without solid action plans.
It is urgent, and I'm just wondering, when will it be too late?
When will it be too late? I think the time for action is now. I think we can't stress enough the need for countries to take serious and ambitious and urgent action at this time. This isn't a situation where we can pass the 1.5 and use technical fixes to pull us back to that level. The consequences of climate change, if we pass that 1.5 degree mark, are irreversible. We're already seeing significant impacts at just 1.1 degree of warming, where we're already witnessing more frequent and devastating climate impacts around the world, and they're hitting women, youth, Indigenous people particularly hard. And really, when we look at the situation, some of the issues that we're still struggling with, or negotiators are still struggling with, are this issue of adaptation and funding for adaptation. If we look forward at what a warming world will bring, the UN is estimating that by 2030, there will be a need for up to $580 billion a year of climate adaptation financing to assist developing countries address their adaptation needs. And so when we think about this, the faster we move on climate change, the less severe the impacts will be. And so the time is done for inaction. We need serious action now.
Talking about the use of words, I noticed that instead of phasing out coal, the word is changed to unabated coal, meaning coal burning done without any carbon capture or storage. Talk us through that, and are these the kind of, it's almost like lawyers have been sent in to change the wording so it sounds good but doesn't really take us anywhere.
Yes, that's absolutely true. The term unabated basically means that it doesn't have a carbon capture and storage component. But what's really needed is that we need to see a full phase out of fossil fuel. And we need to see an end to coal-fired power plants, as well as an end to fossil fuel subsidies. And so these technicalities in language, these little nuances are actually incredibly important. What we need to see is that financing that's now being invested in fossil fuels to be reinvested in renewables. And so you're seeing a watering down of the commitment level with these nuanced terms. And certainly we know that the fossil fuel industry has been quite active at the negotiations. There's over 500 negotiators representing the fossil fuel lobby. And so we need to ensure that our negotiators are standing up for the people and climate, not for fossil fuel lobbyists, not for the profits of few. We need these negotiators to be standing up for the people.
All right, there's another debate, of course, about richer nations and how much compensation they need to pay to developing nations. Earlier this week, I had an interesting conversation with one of the delegates at the Africa Energy Week. And he talked about transition in Africa should not be bound at the same rates and pace as the rest of the world because we have countries where 60% of them have no energy at all. And so for them, getting energy is a first prize. They'll worry about carbon emissions after the fact. How do we address these dilemmas?
Energy poverty is a huge issue. People need energy in order to study, in order to run hospitals, schools. Energy is absolutely critical. But, funding for renewable energy systems will help us leap over that dirty fossil fuel-based electricity, that based dirty energy. And that's a path that Africa does not need to take. For those communities that aren't already reliant on fossil fuels, there is a much better path forward in terms of looking at renewable energies, whether it's a centralized system or distributed. There's no need. It's sort of saying that you would need landlines as opposed to cell phones to address telecommunication issues. We don't need fossil fuels to address energy needs. We need clean, sustainable energy sources that will meet the energy needs of communities and help to meet their sustainable development needs moving forward.
All right, so you're saying that we should
jump... And in terms of those...
Carry on.
Pardon me, sorry, I was just going to add that for those countries that are reliant on fossil fuels and have investments in them, we also have to be very cognizant of the people who are working in these industries and support a just transition for those workers who are currently involved in fossil fuel industries to help ensure that their well-being is met as communities and nations transition to a green economy. And that's absolutely important and needs support and focus.
If there's one thing that I've observed over time is that conversations around green energy, clean energy, climate change, and a need to save the planet have become louder and more urgent with the passage of time. And I'm just wondering, if these politicians continue to play games, might we start to see social unrest because people are becoming desperate as they become more and more affected?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're highlighting something that's incredibly important here, is that climate change is already impacting people around the world. There are, whether it's slow onset events like droughts that have been hitting regions of Africa, whether it's these severe storms that come through in the form of typhoons, in hurricanes, this type of thing, these are having major impacts on people's lives. It's costing people, individuals, families, an incredible amount of money to deal with the impacts of climate change, to recover from these events, to move forward. We're seeing conflicts that are being either intensified or initiated because of the impacts of climate change on natural resources, on farmlands, on livestock, on water resources. And I think that increasingly we're seeing greater local action because people are recognizing that even if their governments aren't prepared to respond or have the capacity to respond, they still need to take actions to address this. And so you're seeing cities take more initiative, you're seeing communities take more initiative, and of course it has to happen at all levels, but it will be so much more effective if we have the support of governments and we have the financial support that developing countries need to enable these climate adaptation and mitigation efforts and help support when the impacts of climate change are so devastating on people's lives.
All right, perhaps as a final question, I'm going to take you away from COP26 to something that you wrote in 2020 that fascinated me, a wake-up call on the need for gender-responsive climate action. And this was COVID-19. Just briefly take us through that. I was quite fascinated by what you wrote.
I can't remember the details of the particular article, but certainly climate change is impacting women disproportionately. That's because really when we look at the impacts of climate change is having on the basis of livelihood that women depend on as small-scale agriculturalists, but also because of gender inequalities and discrimination that leaves women with less resources to actually cope, respond, adapt to climate change. And so when we talk about things like climate finance, we really need to ensure that that climate finance is gender just. And when I say that, it means that we need to make sure that climate finance, that financing to support people is actually reaching women's rights organizations, that it's supporting NGOs who are doing work locally, that it's actually supporting women to build their resilience. Unfortunately, they are honestly experience some of the worst impacts, and we need to make a concerted effort to support those vulnerable people, including women, including youth, including Indigenous people, to ensure that everyone has a fair chance to build the resilience and to be able to move forward in this world that's being so affected by climate change.
Anya, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very, very much indeed. Let's hope that in the remaining hours, something concrete does come out of COP26. Thanks so much indeed for your time.
Thank you for having me.